Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a framework that might just change how you look at our polarized world. We're not talking about left versus right here. We're talking about the very structure of our minds when they're put under political pressure.
I mean, you felt it, right? That feeling that trying to have a productive, good-faith political disagreement has become, well, almost impossible. It feels like we're not just arguing about different facts anymore, but like we're living in completely different realities. So, what is actually going on?
The framework we're exploring today suggests the problem isn't necessarily about bad people or bad ideas. Instead, it offers a structural explanation. It's about the psychological conditions we're all swimming in. It's an analysis of the system, not a judgment on any of the people in it.
Okay, so let's get into where this all comes from. The source of this framework is the work of Professor R.J. Starr, an independent scholar who's been developing these ideas for nearly 30 years, mostly outside of the usual academic circles, which gives him a pretty unique perspective on the problem.
And this was no small project. You can see it started way back in the late 90s with one big structural question. Over the years, his work kind of zoomed in, first looking at specific things like blame and outrage, and then zooming back out to map the entire interconnected system he calls our psychological architecture.
And this is the single powerful question that's been the engine for his entire body of work. It's what you might call a second-order analysis. See, it's not about the surface-level stuff or the specific content of our beliefs. It's about digging deeper to find the root causes, the underlying architecture that shapes our experience, especially when it starts to crumble under pressure.
All right, so let's look at the core concept of his analysis, especially as it applies to politics. It's this idea of a psychological downward shift, a concept he calls psychological regression.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand this is not a clinical diagnosis, it's not a moral judgment either. Starr uses the word regression to describe a predictable functional shift in how our mind works. It's basically what happens when our more advanced, thoughtful thinking gets pushed aside by more basic, survival-oriented processes. This chart lays it out perfectly. On the one hand, you have higher-order functioning. It's slow, it's reflective, it can handle nuance and ambiguity. On the other hand, you have lower-order functioning. This is your brain's rapid response system. It's fast, automatic, and designed for one thing, detecting threats. Regression is simply a prolonged shift from that careful, reflective state on the left to the rapid, reactive one on the right.
So what causes that shift? Well, it doesn't just happen out of the blue. According to this framework, it's activated by a very specific set of environmental conditions that have, frankly, become totally dominant in our modern political life.
First, there's this constant feeling of threat. Not just physical threat, but threats to our identity, our status, our entire way of life. Second, our attention is constantly being squeezed by a super high-speed, high-emotion media environment. And third, our political identity becomes the main filter through which we see everything. Starr argues that these three things create a perfect storm for regression.
And here's what happens when that storm hits. Our thinking collapses into simple binaries, black and white, us versus them, good versus evil. Then, our political identity gets so fused with our sense of self that any disagreement feels like a direct personal attack. And finally, we start moralizing everything. Because a quick moral judgment is way faster and easier than complex analysis.
Okay, now let's scale this up. What happens when this psychological shift isn't just an individual experience, but a societal one? When regression becomes the default mode for an entire population, it can change the very fabric of our public life.
When this state becomes a new normal, disagreement is no longer seen as a chance to learn something new. It's seen as a direct threat. We stop coordinating around shared goals and start coordinating around shared enemies. And maybe most importantly, our shared reality starts to break apart. Not just because we have different facts, but because we are processing reality in fundamentally different ways. The system loses its ability to fix itself.
So here's the crucial takeaway. This framework completely reframes the problem. It encourages us to stop pointing fingers and blaming the other side for being irrational or evil. Instead, it forces us to look at the environment, the conditions that are predictably shaping all of our behavior.
And that, of course, leaves us with a really challenging final thought. Understanding this mechanism is an incredibly powerful first step, but it also raises a much harder question. If the political environment itself is what's driving this regression, what would it actually take to change that environment? That's the real question this analysis leaves us wrestling with.